Benvenuti to Magazzino. Welcome to Magazzino. Welcome back to some of our friends and supporters. I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the entire team. This is our first in-person event since 2 years, actually. So we're very excited to be able to restart and to actually begin the new season of programming for Magazzino in 2022. I wanted to thank all of you for being here and also to support Magazzino. Magazzino is turning 5 this year, and we are a private operating foundation, and what we do is to showcase and to actually help research and deepen research in postwar postwar and contemporary Italian art here in Cold Spring. The way we do this is mainly through fellowship that we grant every year. That is the scholar in resident scholarship that we do offer each year. And I'm just very excited that Katie Larson is our current resident. She started in September, and what you'll hear about today is not only her lecture, but also a little bit about like her research at Magazzino and the overarching theme for this program. What we usually do is that we do select one scholar each year, and we host them here in the Hudson Valley. They're actually here in Beacon, and they really do work with us on a number of research projects, on a number of programs that we do build together. But the culminating kind of event of this fellowship is really the lecture series, and that's what we are finally able to do in person after 2 years remote. Katie is coming after other four scholars that we hosted here, and we will just announce soon the next scholar for the year ahead. I want to thank you, Katie, for working with us throughout this time, and I'm going to also introduce Chiara Mannarino, that is our program and curatorial assistant, and she's been actually working with Katie and the overall team at Magazzino to make this event possible. And I also want to thank all the Magazzino team. I know this is the first of many, and I hope we go back to doing more in-person events soon, for your dedication, flexibility, and to really help us all to really go back on track and to really do events in person again. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us for our first lecture series in our 4-part lecture series. It is a joy and pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Larson, who is our scholar in residence, as Vittorio said, and the curator of this fabulous series. Dr. Katie Larson is an assistant professor in the Art and Art History Department at Baylor University. Her research focuses on painting, collage, and printmaking in the 20th century, with a particular emphasis on postwar Italian art. She has been the recipient of fellowships from the American Academy in Rome and the Gerda Henkel Stiftung. Her work has been published in Art Journal, Art Inquiries, CAA Reviews, and ASAP-J. She is currently working on a manuscript that examines the early career of Alberto Burri and avant-garde artistic practice in 1950s Rome. So without further ado, Katie.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Chiara, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, Vittorio, as well. And thank you to all of you for coming out today. I am thrilled to kick off Magazzino's 2022 Spring Lecture Series. This year's theme, The Politics of Labor in Postwar Italian Art, is purposely broad. I wanted to use the Arte Povera collection at Magazzino to think about the political, social, and cultural factors that led postwar Italian artists to challenge traditional methods of production and systems of value. The 4 lectures in our series will cover artistic developments in Italy from the late 40s through the 1990s, examining both precursors to and major figures within Arte Povera. Our speakers will focus on the impact of leftist politics on arts production, the status of domestic labor and its reconfiguration in collages and ready-mades, and changing conceptions of artistic and material practices in post-war Italy. I hope you'll join us for the next 3 lectures, which will happen every other Saturday at 3 p.m. here at Magazzino. My lecture today is entitled Notes on Making, Art, Labor, and Language in Postwar Rome. The material from this lecture is drawn in part from my book manuscript, which looks at the early career of Alberto Burri and avant-garde artistic practice in 1950s Rome. My work has been generously supported by the Scholar in Residence program at Magazzino, which has afforded me time away from teaching to research and to write, and has provided an inspirational space in which to do so. I'd like to thank Nancy Olnick and Giorgio Ascani, as well as Vittorio Calabrese, for putting this wonderful residency together. I'd also like to thank the hardworking staff at Magazzino who've collaborated with me to bring this lecture series to fruition. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Carolina Chanowska, Chiara Manarino, Carl Solleather, Eve Aaron, and Alex Theodoropoulos. My research focuses in particular on labor as the physical work of making art. I spend a great deal of time thinking about materials and processes employed by artists within the context of their specific historic conditions. I'm also deeply interested in exploring instances of collaboration, or moments when individuals labor together. My talk today will explore both variations on the theme, labor as individual and collaborative acts of making. I was inspired to write this lecture by one image in particular. It's an untitled painting by Jannis Kounellis, made in 1960. It currently hangs in the 3rd gallery of Magazzino, among 5 other multimedia works by the artist. Of the group, it's by far the most unassuming, a simple black and white image painted in enamel on linen. The image consists of the letter J, repeated in black 9 times and whited over 3 times. The black J's are composed in a graphic formation that spans from the upper left to the lower right. They're scattered across the canvas, swelling in number in the middle of the composition. The letters maintain their vertical orientation, and each J roughly lines up within its own horizontal register. Their placement suggests a schoolboy's journal, in which a young Jannis has repeated the first initials of his name over and over. However, in their repetition, the J's also seem to become unhinged from their significance as letters, as they form no identifiable word and thus escape any discernible meaning. Instead, they seem to morph into abstract signs, suggestive of different shapes. The curators have brilliantly drawn out this quality in the painting, juxtaposing it to another untitled work, this one from 2003, in which burlap sacks and a winter coat hang from large metal hooks. When considered next to each other, the J's begin to resemble the hooks, suggesting their more concrete tangibility. Kounellis himself alludes to the materiality of the letter through the use of enamel paint, which he applies thickly. As in many of the paintings in the series, which is known as the Letters or Alphabets series, Kounellis stenciled the image using a cardboard matrix. The letters are not carefully delineated, but instead emphasize shaky black edges that bleed into the white surface. Drips and smudges of paint stain the support, suggesting transfer from that cardboard stencil. The series was created between 1959 and 1963, while Kounellis was a student at the Academy of Fine Arts in Rome. There is a famous photograph of the artist by Claudio Abate, taken in 1960, that shows Kounellis performing in front of one of the works. The artist has draped himself in a second painting and wears a paper headdress. The image captures him as he recites letters and numbers in a monotone voice. The performance recalls Hugo Ball's recitation of Caruana at the Cabaret Voltaire in the summer of 1916. There, Ball also donned an eccentric costume to recite a nonsensical poem. Art historians have also linked Kounellis' interest in poetry, language, and performance to the Italian Hermetic poet Giuseppe Ungaretti and the American expatriate Ezra Pound. Such interpretations overlook the experimentations with art and language by intellectuals in Kounellis' own sphere in 1950s Rome. One of his teachers at the Academy of Fine Arts was Todi Shaloya, a close friend of three of the artists Emilio Villa, Alberto Burri, and Nuvolo, who I'll discuss today. Indeed, Kounellis first showed the alphabet series in 1960 at a gallery in Rome called La Tartaruga, where Burri and Scialoia had recently exhibited their own work. Scialoia is credited with introducing Kounellis to the gallerist Plinio de Martis and helping him to secure his inaugural show there. Their close friend, the art critic and poet Emilio Villa, is known to have attended Kounellis' opening. My talk today examines the activities of this network. I'll begin by introducing you to Villa, best known as an experimental poet, but also significantly a critical figure in avant-garde artistic circles in Rome. Villa serves as a bridge between the historic avant-garde and the so-called neo-avant-garde, between pre-war figures like Ball and Ungaretti, working in the 1920s and 30s, and post-war artists like Kounellis, working in the 1960s. He's also a driving engine behind a number of collaborative projects in 1950s Rome that explore the intersections of art and poetry. I'll introduce you to two such projects, the first undertaken with Burri, entitled 17 Variations on Themes Proposed for a Pure Phonetic Ideology, and the second with Giorgio Ascani, who's known by his nom de guerre Nuvolo, entitled 5 Inventions of Nuvolo and a Poem by Emilio Villa. In addition to his activities as a poet, Villa was also an active art critic and curator. He's one of the earliest critics to recognize the significance of Mimmo Rotella's poetic experimentations, which share a number of points of contact with Villa's own linguistic explorations. In particular, both men were deeply interested in playing with the idea of phonetics, or breaking down language into basic speech sounds. My aim today is to show you that post-war Rome was a place of frenzied experimentation, where the limits of both art and language were being actively tested. Kounellis' alphabet series can be seen to emerge from and respond to this specific historic environment. I want to suggest that through their work, this group of artists sought to reimagine what art and language might look like once free from their indoctrination under fascism. Artistic labor for Villa was construed as the pure act of making, free from any political connotations. As Villa would bombastically claim in 1950, quote, "A painting is the act. The focus is not to receive passively, but it's an act to be performed. It is the act," end quote. In other words, artistic labor constituted an active rather than passive process whereby the artist didn't simply represent what they saw in the world, but rather instead sought to reshape the world. The colleagues with whom Villa collaborated did so in striking ways, by burning, screen printing, ungluing, and stenciling images and objects taken from their everyday environments. Ultimately, for Villa, making art constituted an intensely humanist act, one that centered around the core experience of man from his earliest origins to the present moment. In post-war Rome, art making was intimately tied to the idea of constructing a new worldview, and Villa aimed to collaborate with and support the projects of artists who shared that same goal. So Villa was born in 1914 in a community just outside of Milan. He's part of the same generation as Burri and Rotella, and Nuvolo and Kounellis are more significantly his juniors, born in 1926 and 1936, respectively. Villa began to write poetry as a teenager in seminary school, and he ultimately became a prolific author. He's really quite a remarkable person. He's a man of diverse interests, styling himself as a poet, an artist, an art critic, an etymologist, and a translator. He's also a talented linguist who is fluent in 7 modern languages and a number of local Italian and French dialects. In addition, he could read Latin, ancient Greek, Hebrew, and the early Semitic languages like Sumerian and Akkadian. He moved to Rome in the late 1940s, where he immersed himself in its avant-garde artistic scene. He took a brief hiatus from the city when he relocated to Brazil, where he worked from 1951 to 1952 at the Musée d'Art de São Paulo. There, he inventoried their ancient archaeological collections, and he wrote object labels. Villa moved back to Rome in 1952 and once more became involved in the small but active art scene there. Throughout his career, he preoccupied himself with exploring the origins of man and language, thus explaining the time he spent at the Sao Paulo Museum. In the post-war period, the significance of this exploration became ever more pressing, as the artist and his colleagues sought to locate a new origin of modernism, one that was no longer associated with the fascist past. So unlike their American and British peers, Italian artists faced particular philosophical challenges after the end of the war. Italy had not only been an Axis power, but also an occupied territory, making Italians both the aggressors and the aggrieved. The German army's horrific treatment of civilians, partisans, and soldiers from 1943 to 1945 led Italians to come together against a common enemy, the Nazis. In the post-war public imagination, civilians, partisans, and soldiers all became part of the resistance story, and many sought to deny their own complicity in the fascist regime. The 20 years of Mussolini's dictatorship, known as the Ventennio, came to be viewed as a parenthesis in national history, a historic aside to be skimmed over, and it was hoped eventually forgotten altogether, an idea most famously put forth by the Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce. The collapse of European civilization and the failure of post-World War I revolutionary ideals led artists to declare their desire for a tabula rasa, a clean slate. In the post-war period, artists promoted the idea of a 0 hour, calling for historical amnesia and cultural rebirth. They sought to move away from traditions established under the fascist regime and reimagine what art might be in their new post-war world. This proved a difficult task, as the fascist regime was far less dogmatic than Hitler's Nazi party on issues of cultural production. Many different types of artistic production flourished in Italy during the 1920s and 30s, although state commissions overwhelmingly emphasized figurative imagery that conveyed a narrative. These narratives often underscored ideological positions favored by the regime, as you can see here in Montanarini's Apotheosis of Fascism. In the post-war period, many avant-garde artists thus began painting abstractly, conceiving non-representational imagery as that clean slate or break from fascist tradition. In the 1950s, the widespread call for cultural rebirth reinvigorated Villa's research on the origins of art and language. In light of the kind of work he saw being made in Rome, Villa began to develop a thesis on the parallel nature of ancient people and modern artists as makers, tracing the origins of abstract art back to prehistory. In the non-figurative art of his contemporaries, he saw forms of signification that echoed early man's first attempts at communication. This idea was supported quite obviously in the work of his friend and colleague Giuseppe Capogrossi, who was inspired by images and signs seen in African rock paintings to make his Surfaces series, in which he formed a new abstract visual language through the manipulation of a single structural element, what he terms his fork. Through the fork, Capogrossi constructed a new visual vocabulary. His repeated use of the character follows the logic of a morpheme, this basic building block of language that cannot be further divided. Instead, he multiplied the fork, turned it, inverted it, and created colored sequences to produce unending variations on a theme. This asemic writing, or writing that has no specific meaning or semantic content, suggested to viewers that legibility and coherence of language were no longer key functions of art, which instead sought to promote more open-ended and subjective methods of interpretation. This was the type of artistic investigation that Villa actively supported by writing catalog essays for his friends and by helming the editorship of the journal Arti Visive, which translates into English as Visual Arts. Arti Visive sought to promote abstraction within an international context, seeking to bring Italian avant-garde artists onto the same plane as their American and European peers. The journal actively supported abstract painters at a moment when abstraction in Italy remained relatively controversial. So in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, politicians associated with the Italian Communist Party sought to regulate artistic production. The party sought to promote figuration that supported their ideological platform by, for example, illustrating the struggles and dignity of the working class. We see a good example here on the right by Renato Gattuso, which shows peasants in southern Italy protesting their meager living and working conditions. As a result, abstract artists came under repeated attack by hardline communists who argued that their anti-narrative, anti-figurative work was meaningless and ultimately emblematic of the moral vacuity of capitalism. Paintings like Capogrossy's, in which the image produces no concrete or easily accessible meaning, was seen to undermine the party's core directive. So here it should be noted, though, that Capogrossi, Villa, and the other artists discussed today, they weren't affiliated with the Communist Party. It's because of their promotion of abstraction that they become embroiled in this polemic over the significance of figurative versus abstract painting. And this is a debate that remained a heated point of contention throughout the decade. Villa sought to push back on the Communist Party's negative narrative about abstraction by arguing that it was a legitimate and historic form of human expression. For him, there's a larger theoretical claim at the heart of his thesis. One anecdote in particular helps to explain the poet's position. In 1954, he wrote an article that laid forth his views not only about the prehistoric roots of abstraction, but also the basic principles of artistic labor itself. In the article, he describes how art originated with a simple gesture carried out by a Neanderthal. This Neanderthal had found a whalebone vertebrae, they'd picked it up from the shoreline and brought it back to their dwelling. And this vertebrae was discovered by archaeologists thousands of years later. Villa describes how the Neanderthal seemingly recognized the singularity of the object as not a utilitarian thing, but as an aesthetic form. In removing the bone from the shoreline and carrying it home, the vertebrae became a primitive ready-made, an everyday object that the artist declares to be art, therefore imbuing it with new meaning. For Villa, it's the change in the individual's perception of that particular object that opens up new possibilities for creation and communication. The transformation of an object from one thing into another becomes the core function of the artist's act of making. Ultimately, for Villa, an artistic material can be anything taken from the world, seen in a new light, and given fresh significance. The bone becomes not simply the remains of an animal who died, but in the eyes of the Neanderthal, it becomes a talisman of sorts, imbued with a different and novel kind of power. In the modern context, we can see how this argument might function in relation to the work of Villa's friend Salvatore Meo, who transforms wood, stone, and iron from simple found elements into sculptural statements through the unique juxtaposition and arrangement of the materials. In other words, for Villa and his circle, the central role of the artist, since the dawn of time, has been to conceive of new ways to think about and approach the world. This is the artistic philosophy behind Villa's own poetry, and one that drives his collaborations with other artists. One clear example of this is his partnership with Alberto Burri on a book project entitled 17 Variations on Themes Proposed for a Pure Phonetic Ideology. The two artists worked together on the book between 1953 and 1954, and it was published in 1955. So Villa most likely met Burri in 1949, before the poet departed for Brazil. Burri had only recently begun painting. Prior to his life as an artist, he had served in the Italian fascist army as a soldier, and then later as a medical officer. He had been taken prisoner of war by the Allies in 1943, and while interned, renounced his profession as a doctor. When he returned to Rome at the end of the war, he decided to devote himself to making art. He is completely self-taught, and as such, he never felt limited by artistic training or tradition, but instead reveled in the freedom to produce an entirely new visual lexicon. The book stands as his and Villa's collaborative attempt to propose a new origin for modern art. So 17 Variations consists of one long poem by Villa and 3 original works of art, a cover and 2 interior images by Burri. Burri's artworks were executed individually and mounted as unique pieces into each edition of the 17 Variations. Having created multiple copies of the book, it therefore amounted to a major undertaking and resulted in a substantial series of related works. Villa's poem consists of 17 sections, or what he calls variations. The variations have been written in multiple languages, including Italian, French, English, Spanish, Latin, Provençal, and various Italian dialects. The variations have also been formatted in specific ways so that the words on the page appear as though an abstract visual image, in the tradition of historic avant-garde poets like Stéphane Mallarmé or Guillaume Apollinaire, or the futurist Parola in Libertà, or Words and Freedom. These choices serve to bring attention to Villa's manipulation of the raw matter of language. This is emphasized through a number of poetic decisions made by the artist. For example, his stream of consciousness voice and the quick freehand nature of Burri's drawings points to both artists' active processes of making in the 17 Variations, which become central to the work's meaning. Villa's poem begins, "Imprestami una battaglia di suggestioni tassative, di zanzare, di allegrie, di classiche maniere or impetuose, decise, non timide né tenere." Translated into English, "Lend me a battle of binding suggestions, of mosquitoes of mirth, of classical or impulsive manners, determined, not timid nor tender." On a formal level, the lineation of Villa's stanza, and of the poem generally, consists of long breath lines that are heavily enjambed so that one thought is perpetually contingent upon the next. This characteristic most readily suggests the poem's origins in automatic or stream of consciousness writing, and indeed, a handwritten first draft of the poem from 1950 reveals the poet's working process, documenting the way in which Villa wrote the poem out quickly. His scrawling, looping cursive slides across the page, with dots and X's inserted into the lines, placeholders for words that failed to come speedily enough. Burri's drawings exhibit the same effect of initial quickness and later elaboration. In one example, a drawing that's found in a copy of the 17 Variations now in the Museum of Modern Art, the viewer can chart the way in which the artist moved the pen across the page in rapid, spontaneous strokes. The swift ink marks weave over and across each other, building up one on top of the next to create a delicate linear web. On occasion, the fluid lines have been punctuated by ink blots of hesitation, where the artist's hand paused a moment before turning in a new direction. Later, Burri returned to the drawing to add 3 small areas of gold leaf, perhaps to signify the precious quality of the artist's touch. In the book, we see how the collaborators had become interested in the idea that drawing and writing are modes of signification that share common roots. The gestural and emergent mark making in both prioritizes bodily and material practices in ways that seem particularly productive. The authors show us that writing and drawing don't have to produce legible or recognizable signs for meaning to be conveyed. In fact, throughout 17 Variations, Villa seeks to challenge the reader by producing moments of both comprehension and incomprehension. One example can be found in the author's use of multiple languages. Such variety makes it certain that any average individual wouldn't be able to read the poem from start to finish. In moments of incomprehension, the reader grapples to form meaning, sparking a reversion to a pre-linguistic or proto-linguistic mode of understanding. Words become nothing more than a series of sounds or phonemes, the basic building block of all language and the titular subject of the poem, 17 Variations on Themes Proposed for a Pure Phonetic Ideology. Additional language barriers are embedded into the text through Villa's use of made-up words and of words that have been combined to form new structures. As a result, the poem doesn't offer a single monolithic or monolinguistic view of the world. Instead, it suggests that incomprehensibility opens onto new forms of comprehension, and that this broadening of the mind constitutes one of the very forces that makes us most human. Burri's automatic drawings similarly evoke forms of exploratory pre-linguistic mark-making. In a handful of instances, as on the cover of 17 Variations, Burri expanded on his abstract drawings to emphasize or augment this prehistoric effect. In the drawing, Burri conjured an image of a man using the most basic and modest of means: a circle for a head, lines to indicate legs, arms, and body. The crude nature of Burri's figure recalls early cave painting, in other words, primitive attempts at forming a visual language. The collage found in the same book reveals a second reference to prehistoric modes of making. The nylon support of the collage bears the marks of burning. The uneven singes in the nylon stand as the remains of the once swiftly moving flame as it devoured that delicate fabric. Although performed in a past moment, the immediacy and quickness of the action is still felt through blooms of thinned red and blue paint stained into the surface of the support. These blooms of paint seem keyed to the movement of the fire's diffusion, spreading laterally according to the weft and warp of the fabric. Burri further alludes to the operation of the flame with a small touch of red fabric placed beneath the burn mark in the upper right corner. Constantly in dialogue with that burnt edge, the ever-present red becomes a symbolic marker that represents the artist's original experience of making, and in particular of burning. This act of burning, when compared to the cover of the book, can seem to reference early man's discovery of fire. In the collage, Burri engages in an unusual performative action. In 17 variations, burning becomes an artistic practice for the first time. That nylon support, that muddled brown scrap of fabric, was likely taken from the artist's rag pile. Once detritus, the artist transforms the humble material into art, recalling the action of Villa's Neanderthal. Through these specific and intentional decisions, the artist and his collaborator declare their position on the role of the artist in modern society. For them, it's an individual who's tasked with seeing and presenting the world in novel, sometimes unexpected and surprising ways. For Burri, such investigations opened up new directions in his artistic practice, allowing him to think more expansively about the materials and processes of art. It's one way in which we can begin to understand better his radical use of ready-made objects like sacking, plastic, and wood veneer. Burning, in particular, becomes a major compositional catalyst for the artist, present in diverse ways throughout the series he produces in the 50s and early 60s. A third participant in the making of 17 variations was the printmaker Giorgio Ascani, known by his nickname Nuvolo. Like Burri, Nuvolo grew up in the Umbrian town of Città di Castello, and in the post-war period, he became a very close friend of the artist. Born in 1926, Nuvolo was too young to be drafted to fight in the Italian fascist army, as Burri had been. Where Burri spent the mid-1940s interned by the Allies in a prisoner of war camp, Nuvolo joined local resistance efforts against the German occupation. It's during this time that he earned his nickname, Nuvolo, which means cloudy, describing his uncanny ability to appear and disappear silently into the landscape. Nuvolo's parents worked in the Tipo Litografico Lappi, one of the many typographic and lithography workshops in Città di Castello, and his good friend Angelo Baldelli ran the Industrial Technical School for Graphic Arts in the city, meaning that from an early age, he was surrounded by people who worked in printmaking. In 1950, Burri encouraged the young artist to move to Rome, where Nuvolo helped him as a studio assistant and supported himself by working as a photographic engraver. Nuvolo also began screen printing the covers of Arti Visive, and he's given credit in that second line there. For the printing of 17 variations, he returned to Città di Castello to oversee the letterpress process. During this same period, Villa and Nuvolo began their own collaboration, producing a book entitled 5 Inventions of Nuvolo and a poem by Emilio Villa. This book was published in 1954. The book was structured in a similar way to 17 variations, with Villa publishing a single long poem that's illustrated by 5 images and a cover by Nuvolo. Similar to Villa's collaboration with Burri, each of Nuvolo's images were unique and individually mounted into the book. In 5 Inventions of Nuvolo and a poem by Emilio Villa, the authors actively sought to break down established hierarchies of form through the production of new linguistic and visual inventions. Villa published a poem he'd been working on since 1941, entitled Si ma lentamente, or Yes But Slowly. This poem exhibits a similar stream of consciousness voice as found in 17 variations, a fact reinforced by the poem's length and unusual use of punctuation. Nuvolo produced screen-printed images that resembled drip paintings, using a technique he'd begun experimenting with in 1951. One of the most interesting features of the poem is the intentional mixing of high and low forms. Our Emergent has identified a similar strategy in the work of Pier Paolo Pasolini from the 1960s, describing it as positive contamination, or a dynamic interpenetration of high and low. Emergent suggests that this was a technique employed by Pasolini to resist neo-capitalist monoculture by preserving social and semantic difference. Villa's use of positive contamination can be understood in much the same way, particularly as a resistance to monoculture, here conceived as an inheritance from fascism. The fascist regime sought to regulate and control many aspects of cultural production, most pertinently for Villa by implementing a language policy that promoted an ideal or pure Italian language, opposing the use of local dialects and foreign languages. The regime sought to unify the Italian peninsula through a standardization of language, an act that Villa, as a poet and a lover of language, sought to repudiate. As in 17 variations, in Yes But Slowly, there exists an abundance of both vernacular and foreign terms. In addition, he includes references to scholarly or high and everyday or low undertakings. In the poem, Villa weaves together Latin sayings, selections from the Catholic liturgy, references to poems by T.S. Eliot, as well as phrases from popular songs, nursery rhymes, and crude sexual allusions. The intermingling of high and low that we find in Villa's poem represented for him a kind of resistance, an anti-fascist stance that celebrated the diversity and value of different kinds of cultural production. The images that illustrate the poem engage in the same kind of labor, using the commercial or low means of screen printing to produce images that suggest the high or avant-garde aesthetic of drip painting. The book highlights a new genre of art making invented by Nuvolo in 1951, called serotipie, or silk tape. In the serotipie, Nuvolo experimented with screen printing to make monoprints. So he's using an open screen, and you can see a few examples of materials from his studio here. For those of you not familiar with screen printing, you use a screen. The screen generally is blocked either physically or chemically to create a stencil that then ink is pulled through. So you have this kind of repetition of the image over and over again. So Nuvolo's not doing that. He's not blocking the screen. He's using an open screen and dripping ink across that open screen. So doing so, he would either flood the image with ink, as we see here, or drip ink across the screen to make unique and unrepeatable images that resemble the gestural abstraction of colleagues like Roberto Matta and Jackson Pollock. This is a completely novel use of screen printing at the time. Up until this point, screen printing had only been used in Italy for commercial purposes, to make flyers, to produce cheap newspapers and magazines, and to print signs for advertisements. It is a quick and easy way to make images for mass distribution. The medium wouldn't gain widespread popularity in the art world until Andy Warhol and Robert Rauschenberg began experimenting with it in the 1960s. In the 1950s, there's really no term to describe the kind of work being done by Nuvolo, painting by means of screen printing, thus necessitating the invention of this new category of art making. In 5 Inventions, Nuvolo uses screen printing in a way that runs counter to its core function, namely the production of multiples. Instead of using the screen as a stencil to produce the same image over and over again, the screen itself becomes a tabula rasa, a clean slate from which to reconfigure traditions of art making. This is literally enacted through his technical processes. By dripping ink over the open matrix instead of using a stencil, Nuvolo produces unique and unrepeatable images every time completely reconfiguring the medium of screen printing as it had been used up until that point. The idea of a tabula rasa is also metaphorically presented through Nuvolo's liberatory aesthetic of the drip, freed from any formal cultural connotations or larger ideological messaging. In avant-garde practices from the 1950s with which Nuvolo would have been familiar, the drip represented a type of automatic process that emerged from the free, unregulated action of the artist's mind and body, a visual manifestation of subconscious impulses. Its effect captured the same gestural and emergent mark-making found in Burri's automatic drawings. In theory, both emerge from a tabula rasa or a clearing of the mind, in much the same way as Villa's stream of consciousness writing. All three examples represented for the artist new ways of seeing and approaching the world, standing in marked contrast to the traditions and regulations that had previously dominated Italy's cultural landscape. Like Nuvolo, the images produced by Mimmo Rotella in the early 1950s similarly evoke the gestural and all-over field of painterly abstraction. Yet where Nuvolo sought to engage critically with the processes of commercial production, Rotella sought to employ its products, namely the advertisement posters plastered all over the city's walls. Between 1953 and 1954, Rotella began collecting these ready-made images from the streets of Rome. He would detach or unglue the poster from the wall and then reassemble, recombine, and re-tear those same pieces within his studio to make a new composition. For Rotella, the significance of the process was located not in the act of collage or gluing, but in décollage or ungluing. As with Nuvolo and Villa, the strategy of positive contamination pervades Rotella's practice. In his décollages, he undermines both the seductive freedom of gestural abstraction and the clear legibility of commercial posters to produce something more ambivalent and intermedial, neither painting, print, nor collage. Décollage ultimately centers the taking apart or ungluing of old forms, the deconstruction of both high and low visual languages. The process finds its roots in Rotella's poetry, which the artist began writing in 1949, 5 years before he began making the décollages. He characterizes his poetry as phonetic, and its basic structure echoes that of Villa's in 17 variations. Both artists emphasize their interest in the phoneme, or the basic unit of sound in language. The phoneme is the cousin of the morpheme, discussed in Capogrosse's work, which describes a unit of written rather than spoken language. The emphasis on the phoneme speaks to both Villa and Rotella's interest in the performance of poetry. Rotella recalled that when he first began making the poems, he wasn't aware of futurist or Dadaist poetry, but instead arrived at his lines through reasoning. He claims, quote, "Making pictures, I said to myself. With abstract painting, I express myself through invented forms and colors. Couldn't poetry do the same thing too, using invented sounds and words? So I started creating my first phonetic poems, which were rather lyric. I also wrote a manifesto in which I said that the human voice must not limit itself to the monotony of conventional language, but is a continuous source of natural musical instruments," end quote. There are wonderful pictures of Rotella performing his phonetic poems in Rome, in which he makes instruments from found materials and speaks out the letters, numbers, and sounds that compose his poems. As Rotella intimates, it wasn't a far leap from thinking about the abstract expression of forms in painting to the abstract expression of sounds in poetry. In focusing on the raw materiality of language, he sought to break words and sounds down to their most basic forms, ungluing them from any utilitarian value. Instead, language became artistic matter that he could pull apart and fragment. In rearranging scraps of language across the page, the artist recognized its material quality, which seemed to take on new physical and semantic significance. The artist's reflections on the substance of language ultimately led him to question the materials of art. He would write in his 1949 manifesto that the sound effects taken from reality, those bangs, whizzes, and whirs of the city, correspond to the elements of mixed media in sculpture or collages in painting, those objects ready-made and found in the urban environment. He began by exploring everyday materials collaged on the page. Now, collage, as Ralph Ubel suggests, represents an artistic procedure with a superior capacity to emphasize the moment of fabrication, this act of making. In the décollage, this moment of fabrication is exactly what Rotella seems to emphasize, the act of pulling down a poster from the wall, ultimately ungluing the signifier from the signified. Villa was one of the first critics to recognize the significance of Rotella's décollages, featuring his work in a 1955 article in Arti Visive, and including the décollages in an exhibition that same year, held uniquely on a boat docked in the Tiber River. And I apologize for the bad quality of the image, but you can see a sense of what that exhibition would have looked like there. For him, the works represented a logical extension of his own practice, in which the interrogation of language had become central. Rotella's décollages ask the viewer to look in a new way at the materials and processes of art making. They seem to exemplify Villa's imperative that, quote, a painting is the act. The focus is not to receive passively, but it's an act to be performed. It is the act, end quote. Kounellis began making his alphabet series at the height of this artistic experimentation in Rome. His teacher at the Academy of Fine Arts was Todi Shaloya, a close friend of Villa, Burri, and Nuvolo, and a fellow editor at Arti Visive. The alphabet series advanced in sophisticated and surprising ways the explorations of language begun by that older generation of artists. In the series, we see the artist breaking down language into its constituent forms, as both morphemes, or basic units of language, and phonemes, or basic units of sound. Kounellis' performance of the poetry written in his paintings seems to most fully and literally embody Villa's idea of the active rather than passive nature of art making. It is as if Kounellis seeks to reinvent the Italian language by starting from its pre-verbal roots and introducing new sounds and letters. Here, the J, a letter not traditionally found in the 21 vowels and consonants that make up the Italian language, but instead associated with foreign words, like Jannis, the artist's Greek name. In 1966, Kounellis and his friend, the critic and poet Mario Diacono, would publish a book called Jannis Kounellis Alphabets, and a text by Mario Diacono, which interlaced the artist's imagery with Diacono's own experimental poetry. Diacono discussed the publication as an exercise in visual sign and verbal shattering, a description that recalls Villa's own collaborations with Burri and Nuvolo. Written across the canvas, the letters don't reveal the hand of the artist, but instead appear as if typed on a page. Where Nuvolo sought to liberate himself from the stencil, Kounellis limits himself to its mechanical maneuvers, painting the J's with the help of a cardboard cutout. In so doing, his painting explicitly draws on advertisement signs found in Rome's urban environment. These signs are detached from their semantic significance in a conceptual procedure similar to that found in Rotella's décollages. The casual drips obliquely reference and perhaps critique the gestural abstraction still relevant in Italy in the late 1950s. This juxtaposition of high and low extends the investigations of Burri, Nuvolo, and Rotella, while also alluding to a sea change in the role that popular culture and the everyday world would have in the art of the 1960s. Kounellis' alphabet series evoke a complex network of references. Today, I've suggested one line of inquiry among many. To my mind, the series demonstrates the rich dialogue in Rome around issues of art, labor, and language. It's a deeply humanist inquiry that seeks to configure art making as a radical action, one that frees the artist from traditions and limitations imposed by education and culture in order to open up new and inspired ways to think about and reshape the world. For Villa, art and language were not about representation, but rather creation. In all of his collaborative practices, he aimed to show that poetry and painting shouldn't merely mirror the world, but instead seek to remake it. Thank you. I am happy to take any questions that the audience might have at this point, and my colleague will be handing out the microphone. So.
Hi, Katie. Thank you so much. That was such a fascinating lecture. And I'm curious to know if any of the artists, or the artists that you discussed, kind of declared themselves formally at some point as a group, or if that didn't happen. And also, if you could speak maybe about some of the other artists in their circle.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, what's really interesting, and I think one of the reasons that the connections between these artists have been overlooked is that they never declare themselves part of a group. Burri, very, very briefly and early in his career, is associated with a group called the Gruppo Origine with Capogrossi and Mario Bellocco. But that group falls apart very quickly, and I think after that experience, he decides that he doesn't want to affiliate himself in that way. Much of my research revolves around what I'm terming the generation of arti visive, these artists that are working on this journal together. So while they're not declaring themselves formally part of a group as we might think about it today, I see their kind of collaboration and work on this journal as a declaration of kind of common interests. And so the artists that we talked about today, including Salvatore Meo and Giuseppe Capogrossi, Ettore Colla, Tori Shaloya, these are all artists that are working on this journal in particular, which is a really kind of interesting historical document into the time period. So Arti Visive is published between 1952 and 1958. And it's really focused on the promotion of abstract art in particular. And so you get a nice sense of what these artists are thinking about and looking at and really kind of deeply debating in Rome very specifically at this moment. So there isn't kind of formalized group structure that comes into play, but when you connect them back to this journal, you can begin to draw out these kind of themes and commonalities that otherwise might not be so apparent in the work of someone like Capogrossi and Burri, but are there kind of in these kind of subtexts of their work and of their participation in that journal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, Ed.
Hi, was there a dialogue between these artists and the American artists of the 1960s, like Rauschenberg and Warhol and even Rosenquist, but they were extrapolating from advertising and assembly and printmaking and screen printing in terms of, like, you have this political change in Rome based on war and a reaction to fascism, and then you have sort of this 1950s approach to the ascendancy of America after World War II, and then sort of the political upheaval that we had in this country in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. Is there a parallel there?
Yeah, well, there are a good number of American artists coming over to Rome and to Italy in the 1950s and 60s, and so there is a lot of exchange happening between Italian artists and American artists, and vice versa. We have a number of Italian artists coming here to the United States on fellowships and to work. So there is a lot of exchange. Very famously, Rauschenberg visits Burri's studio in 1953, and this is before he starts making his famous series of the Combines, and he comes back to the US and starts working in all sorts of non-traditional materials, and for the rest of his life, Burri is very upset that he's not given credit for being a kind of source of inspiration for Rauschenberg. But it's very controversial. So we have this kind of major moment in Italian art history in which in 1964, Robert Rauschenberg wins the kind of main prize at the Venice Biennale. And that's seen as this kind of real moment of sea change that marks the ascendancy of kind of American painters as the top most kind of significant painters that one has to grapple with. And so our Italian artists are very much actively exchanging ideas with American artists, but also very much in this kind of this contentious dialogue, I would say, with them about what is happening in the art world and what the shape of art is going to look like. So yeah, Rauschenberg is a major player in thinking about transatlantic dialogue at that moment.
I find that interesting because this evolution is never talked about when you study art of the 60s, or, you know, it never really comes up.
Yeah, well, you know, I think Rome has long been an understudied site of cultural production. Often when we talk about Italian modern and contemporary art, we're talking about Milan or Turin. And for some reason, Rome is just not a place that gets a lot of attention, even though it has a ton of really interesting activity happening there, particularly in the 50s and early 60s. And this is artistic activity, but also tons of wonderful galleries that are popping up and a lot of exchange happening between not only just American and Italian artists, but European and Italian artists. So it's this moment of kind of really exciting experimentation where artists, I think, feel a little bit like they're not bound to what had come before. They're not bound to education or tradition, and they're doing things that are really quite remarkable in terms of the kinds of processes that they're using, the kinds of materials that they're willing to experiment with. And some of it looks terrible. You know, some of the Salvatore Meo works, you're like, this is so bizarre. But some of it looks really, really fabulous and great. And we can see how it inspires this kind of generation in the 1960s to think about what the role of the everyday world is within the art object. And you know, we can see that in our arte povera artists as well. So I think that these artists, particularly the artists I'm talking about, their interest in the kind of primitive roots or tracing art back to its most primal instinct, and their interest in the art of the everyday world are legacies that carry on through the art of arte povera. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was such an excellent lecture. And I just wanted to ask a little bit about this note that you picked up in terms of the legacy of this for the 1960s, and ask your thoughts on the connection to something like Gruppo 63. And do you see this as a precursor, and how much was the linguistic experimentation that was fostered in the 1960s? How much were critics and writers looking back to these specific works?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Gruppo 63 and also like Poesia Visiva, these are artistic groups that are coming out in Italy that are like really explicitly experimenting with breaking down language and doing so through both poetic terms, but also using collage and different kind of artistic materials. And you know, in my mind, undoubtedly Villa is a person who is important for the history of the development of those kinds of groups. And he knows all of those kind of main players, but he never associates himself with those, or never kind of officially associates himself with those kinds of groups. It is somewhat clear that he's a kind of difficult character. And he lives a very alternative lifestyle. And so I think that as he moves forward into the 60s, begins to impact some of his relationships with some of these artists. But he's close with Mario Diacono and other kind of major figures within the Italian literary world. And so to my mind, his importance is really as this kind of bridge figure between our Dadaists and Giuseppe Ungaretti and the Hermetic poets in the 20s and 30s, and then what's happening in the 60s. There seems to always be this kind of gap in scholarship that like the artists of the 60s are just looking all the way back to the 20s and 30s without thinking about, well, like there isn't a vacuum in the 50s of this kind of investigation. And so I think Villa is kind of one of those kind of bridge characters in many ways. Yeah. Yeah. Well, if there are no more questions, I believe that we have a cocktail hour in Gallery 8. We would love for you to join, and I'd love to talk more with anyone who wants to talk more one-on-one about the lecture. Thank you all so much for coming today. It really was a pleasure to present my research to you.